Colour is a power that directly influences the soul. Colour is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers. The soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand which plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul. What an amazing quote from Vasily Kandinsky's concerning the spiritual in art. Welcome back to Series 2 of Stories in Colour, a podcast from the National Gallery in London, uncovering the mysteries of how colour has changed the world. Today we're looking at a fascinating subject, which is synesthesia, a joining together of sensations that are normally experienced separately, and in particular sound colour synesthesia. And it's a subject that so many of you have asked us about, so we cannot wait to dive into it. I'm Beks from the Digital Department here at the National Gallery, and with us today I'm joined by Professor Jamie Ward and Dr Deborah Pritchard. Jamie is a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Sussex here in the UK, and he's one of the world's leading experts on synesthesia and is author of several books, including The Frog Who Croaked Blue, Synesthesia and the Mixing of the Senses. Dr Deborah Pritchard is an award-winning British composer known for her synesthesia. She has been performed worldwide by the London Symphony Orchestra, BBC Symphony Orchestra, London Sinfonietta and the BBC Singers. She is Associate of the Faculty of Music, Oxford and the Royal Academy of Music. She was Visiting Fellow at Keble College, Oxford from 2022 to 2023. Huge welcome to both of you. We've also been joined in the studio by violinist Greta Mutlu and cellist Richard Harwood, who will help illustrate Deborah's experience of synesthesia for us. So we're going to dive into what synesthesia is to start with. Jamie, help us understand. What is synesthesia?
We can think of synesthesia as an extra sense that's tagged on to the experiences that most people have. So most people listening to music is purely an auditory thing. But if you're a synesthete, maybe the music you would see as colours and shapes and textures that are dancing. Or maybe as you're listening to my words, you might taste them. So synesthesia is like an augmented experience that's added on to the typical experience of most people. But of course, if you're a synesthete, you can't imagine what life is like to just listen to music and not also see it. So it feels perfectly normal to a synesthete. It's something they've had throughout their entire life.
So for them, it's a completely normal experience. It's a biological difference, I guess we could describe it as.
Yes, we can think of synesthesia as a difference in the wiring of our brain. We all have different brains because of our experience and different genes, but synesthetes have a particular way of thinking and of perceiving the world that's kind of unique to them, that creates what we might think of as a kind of augmented or altered or extended reality of the senses.
Amazing. So are there lots of different kinds of synesthesia? Are there ones that are more common than others?
So some of the more common types of synesthesia are experiencing things like the calendar and numbers in space. So maybe the number 1 is down here on the left and the number 10's there, and then it turns a corner and goes this way. Or the calendar's like a hula hoop that goes round your body with the months of the year, and your birthday's at 30 degrees to the right, or something like this. And this is maybe 4 or 5% of the population, so relatively common. Colours for letters and numbers, maybe 1%, and then colours for sound and music, rarer than that. And of course, music and sounds have lots of different aspects. So the pitch of the sound, whether it's high and low, the particular instruments or timbre that produces it. And synesthetes can kind of latch on to different aspects of the music. So for some, it might be the musical key, like whether a piece of music is composed in A minor or G major. And for others, it might be individual notes that have particular shapes or hues.
Cool. And do people mostly know that they're synesthetes straight away? Like, at what point do people realise typically?
So synesthetes go through a bit of a voyage of discovery that, of course, you assume that your reality is shared by everyone. So somebody with synesthesia assumes that everybody else knows what colour Monday is or what colour this particular note is. And then, of course, at some point, they might get challenged by that. A parent or a teacher or friend would say, "What are you talking about? Nobody else has this." And they ask around, they discover, actually, nobody else does have this. So they go from thinking everyone has it to thinking that they're the only person in the world who has it. And then there's a second discovery where they find this name, or maybe they meet somebody else with this kind of experience. And then they realize, actually, they're not unique, but it is rare.
And is it possible to say definitively whether people have synesthesia, or is it Is it something that we know definitively, but because of personal experience? Does that make sense? Is there a way to scientifically, I guess, measure it?
There are various ways in which we can do that. I mean, one of the characteristics of people with synesthesia is that their colours are very stable, provided we can present them with the same thing over and again. So if the letter A is a particular shade of red, it will always be that shade of red. With sounds, obviously, presenting the same sound over time can be difficult because of the acoustic environments and so on, but still they would be broadly similar. And we can show that that's a characteristic of people with synesthesia. Of course, we can look in their brains and show, although you can't see it just by looking at the scan, you can kind of train computers to kind of detect that there is synesthesia in their brains using AI. And there are other ways in which we can look at it. Synesthesia runs in families, so there will be a genetic basis to synesthesia, but we haven't found the synesthesia gene that we can kind of take somebody's genome and say, you have it, you don't have it. But it's in there somewhere.
Okay, so consistency is a big part of the experience.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, consistency.
Amazing. And Deborah, how do you experience the world as a synesthete?
So my synesthesia is really linked to the spaces that are in between the notes. So not actually with a key signature or individual notes, but actually the space in between, so the intervals. And I find that major and minor thirds are warmer and fourths and fifths in a musical chord are cooler. And that's how my synesthesia happens.
Warmer and cooler in terms of the colour?
Warmer and cooler in terms of the colour, but then also the feel of it as well, and how it makes the chord resonate. And of course, other parameters are also important, like how loud and soft, and maybe the texture and the timbre, the way you're playing the note, perhaps even the rhythm could come into play as well. But the starting point for me every time would be the actual musical interval in the space, and that's where the colour link comes in.
And where are your synesthetic colours? Are they kind of in your mind's eye or out there? What do they look like? How would you describe it?
That's a really good question. Because my synesthesia is so specific, I find it quite difficult to have immediate responses to quite a lot of classical music because the triad is used so frequently, which will have the same intervals, so the perfect fifth and the third. And a lot of the music we know, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, all has those intervals. When you get to perhaps the middle of the 20th century, when composers are starting to use different intervals, and we'll talk about that a bit later probably, I can start to have a better reaction. But actually, the most practical thing to say to you would be that my synesthesia happens the best and most viscerally is when I write music in response to colour, so the other way around. So when I'm looking at paintings and imagery and then imagine the colour in my mind's eye or see the colour, but then take that and use that as part of my creative process. So in answer to your question, I see the literal colour and I will translate that through musical intervals. But I think as you go down the trajectory of creation and that imaginative pathway, you will also have colours of your mind's eye as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just like hearing this completely different experience to mine of colour and sound. That's amazing. One of our audience members, or actually we've had this question quite a lot come up, Jamie, are people who experience synesthesia more creative than those who don't? So is there any commonality between synesthesia and creatives or artists?
Yes, we've looked at this in a variety of ways. So one just asking about hobbies, the other asking about occupations. And we do find that people are more likely to go into creative industries, very broadly defined. If we ask about music as a hobby, for example, we find that people with synesthesia are more likely to play an instrument or spend time practicing this, but particularly those for which music triggers colours and visual experiences. So it seems as if there's a general trend for people with synesthesia to go into creative industries, but maybe the type of synesthesia you experience is like an added layer in which you are kind of drawn to music because of the experiences it evokes in you. But also visual art as well. It's more common, this, whether it's graphic design or painting as a hobby.
And do we know why? Do we know the causation?
We don't know why. I mean, like I say, I think the beauty of the synesthetic experience is a motivating drive, but I think that there might be other more kind of what I'd call basic traits amongst synesthetes. So they're very good at detecting patterns. So these might be visual patterns, it might be patterns in music. So informal tests in the laboratory, are these two patterns the same or different? And we make it quite hard. Synesthetes do better than average on these kinds of tests.
Okay.
So it seems as if they have different ways of thinking. They also have very good what we call mental imagery. So if I ask you to think of an apple, how vivid is that on a 1 to 10 scale? A synesthete will give you a higher rating than somebody without synesthesia, even though that isn't a synesthetic question. I'm just asking you to visualize a holiday or an object. Synesthetes are very good at creating vivid experiences internally.
Deborah, is that true in your experience?
I think that's definitely true. And personally, I have a very, very vivid imagination. I can imagine colours and shapes, and that obviously helps me be a composer. And it also actually reminded me of the famous thing that Michelangelo said, that he saw the angel in the marble and he carved until he set him free. And it's that idea, if Michelangelo could never imagine that art, then we'd never have these beautiful statues. And I don't know if I'm right about this, but there's a condition called, is it aphantasia? The inability to imagine. Do you come across that?
Yes, yeah. This is something that's kind of documented. So we would say that in general, people with synesthesia are the opposite of aphantasia or hyperphantasia, that they have very vivid images. Synesthetes can have lack of imagery. What they then say is, I know what colour it is, but I don't see it. So they're still having colour associations, but it has a different quality. It's more like a quality of, I don't know, a verbal association perhaps than seeing it, or more kind of conceptual and less pictorial.
Amazing. Okay. For this next question, I think it's going to be very helpful for us to have Greta, our violinist, to help us illustrate. So Greta will come and join us. And I'm going to ask Jamie why certain sounds might be certain colours.
So if we have two synesthetes kind of with us, which we don't right now, and ask them to describe their colours, they will differ. So not every synesthete has exactly the same colour for a sound. But once we have like a room full of synesthetes and we ask, we can notice that there are certain trends. So what we find amongst people with synesthesia is that high-pitched notes have certain characteristics of being smaller and higher up and more jaggedy, and lower-pitched ones are more bulbous and lower down and darker in colour. So although synesthetes see these in a vivid way, actually other people have them either in metaphor or maybe as other associations. Even newborn infants, if we play them a sound and show them two different video animations, they will look at the matching one. So high pitch sounds being more jagged and smaller, for example. Do you want to illustrate that with your own experience?
Yes, and actually just to say that, talking about Kandinsky again, Kandinsky did say in his book concerning the spiritual art, he said, the sound of colours is so definite that it would be hard to find anyone who would try and express yellow in the bass notes or a dark lake in the treble. And it backs up really what you say, that actually when you start thinking about it, we do share some similar understandings. Would you like me to show some of this literally, perhaps with Greta on the violin?
Yes,
at this stage. So welcome, Greta. If we imagine a bright colour such as yellow, what you could do is play a double stop note where we've got a high F sharp and an open A. And what I'm going to ask Greta to do is actually play that with very rapid bow strokes, which we call tremolo, but it means that she'll get a kind of shimmering effect. And she's also going to play it closer to the bridge, which means that the resonance of the violin will also add to that. So we have quite a lot of different parameters there on the instrument that help us to imagine yellow. And perhaps now play it very loud, as if it's yellow bursting forth out of its boundaries. Wonderful. And then to demonstrate the contrast, maybe thinking about a darker colour such as a deep purple, I wonder if you could play your lowest string on the violin and maybe play us a very smooth moving A to an E flat, but maybe quite expressive and using what we call vibrato. So there's a bit more tone quality and depth to the sound. And once more. And we can hear straight away how different that darker sound is from the very bright, shimmering high one.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Greta. It's amazing to be able to hear that. So, Jamie, does synesthesia happen in certain parts of the brain?
Our visual experiences tend to get divided up in the brain. So there are parts of the brain that are specialized for color and parts that are specialized for shape and motion and so on. So there is a part of the brain that responds to color, including illusory colors that we might kind of have in illusions and so on. And this is what is triggered by synesthesia, but actually also perhaps when we're imagining colors as well. So when you have synesthesia, it's not quite like imagining in that it's involuntary. You can't switch the colors on and off in the same way as you can when you imagine an apple, but it is that same part of the brain that's involved in creating color experiences, whether through the eyes, through the imagination, or through synesthesia.
And is there any commonality in how non-synesthetes report? I guess it's not at all the same experience, but we've just heard illustrated why certain sounds might be certain colours, and they sort of made sense to me. But obviously I don't have synesthesia, so is there a reason for that?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting because then it kind of opens the question of, to what extent is synesthesia special, and we all have it, but it's a latent kind of trait and so on. So people without synesthesia would also use the words dark and light in the way that you did, but they wouldn't see any kind of dark and light, and they wouldn't have the same vividness or the same consistency. So I don't know what dark it was for you, but if it's a dark purple, it will be a dark purple. Whereas for a non-synesthete, it could be dark purple or dark brown. They don't have that kind of specificity. Yeah. They're not really seeing it in some sense. They're kind of creating it as an abstraction or whatever. It's not a definite experience in the way that it is for a synesthete. So there are these commonalities, but the way they manifest in synesthesia is quite unique compared to people who don't have this.
That's so helpful to understand. Thank you. Now feels like a good point for us to take a quick break. So thank you so much. I feel like we've had an amazing introduction to what synesthesia is. And after the break, we'll be asking Deborah a little bit more about how colours and sounds associate for her, and then how that affects her work as a composer. Welcome back from the break. Deborah, could you explain a little bit more about how your colour sound interval synesthesia feels to you? What does that experience feel like?
Yes, I've already explained a bit how my synesthesia happens with the intervals and the spaces in between the notes. But I think because of that, because there's so much of a link between perhaps my feelings and my heart and also my mind, there's more of my senses being used. Perhaps the experience is slightly more life-enhancing. I'm more in touch with who I am, or perhaps more connected to my soul. It does give it a much more deeper spiritual meaning than it might otherwise do. And it made me think of what Kandinsky said, that all the arts are encroaching upon each other in this kind of spiritual pyramid. And one day together, if we combine all the arts, that we'll reach heaven in some way. And so I think it just brings that slightly sublime quality, if you like, sort of puts you in touch with something other than yourself.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how your work has been inspired by Olivier Messiaen, the composer, and how your compositions have been inspired by him?
Yes, I think this deep sense of purpose with synesthesia and that feeling that it really matters and means something has definitely influenced my work, in that it's about what I experience, but it also matters to me what the audience experience. Is there a way to translate a sense of hope or a sense of light and darkness? And the composer, Messiaen in particular, has been quite a big experience. So Messiaen, 1908 to 1992, perceived sound colour as a natural resonance between his hearing and his sight, which makes me think of these natural resonances with complementary colours and harmonics. And one piece of his that has influenced me is called Couleur de la Cité Céleste, Colours of the Celestial City, where he literally tries to show all the different coloured gemstones that are mentioned in Revelation. So you've got sapphire and emerald and all these different colours. And in the score, he goes even further, and he says this: the form of this work depends entirely on colour. The melodic or rhythmic themes, the complexes of sound, all evolve in the way of colours. And he also notates colour in the score that the clarinetist or even the conductor might think about those colours when the piece is performed. Now, of course, you could argue, well, actually, if you don't have synesthesia, how could you possibly do that? And I think my feeling on it is if you take him at his word and you trust him with what he's saying, you will understand his piece at a far deeper level. And that being said, with some of my work, I've been influenced by this way of thinking. So I responded to Messiaen's piece with my own work called Colour Céleste, which also depicts these glimmering, shining, colourful gemstones. But for the violin and cello, how might we actually hear these colours using my synesthesia? And so I'm delighted that Greta and Richard have joined us to demonstrate these pieces. And the first one that you're going to hear depicts the idea of red. And we have an extract that is very vibrant, using the resonance of open strings. And by that, I mean the natural strings on the instrument where they resonate the best. And they're just going to play that short extract for us now. And the next extract we're going to hear is based around the colour orange, so with the jacinth stone. And this one still has the warmth and the life-enhancing quality of red, but it's just slightly more relaxed and it has a slightly deeper meaning to it. And you'll hear how the violin just emerges upwards and the cello takes on this very resonant, warm, expressive line just to evoke the warmness of orange. Then for contrast, I'm going to just show a cooler colour. And this is green, so the idea of emerald. And what we'll hear here is the violin and cello playing what we call a canon, which means they're playing in echo to each other. The idea that green is perhaps more mysterious and peaceful. And for me, whilst I tend to use intervals such as the fourth and the fifth, I also amongst that use quite scalic material too. And they're going to demonstrate that and how important it is that it's very quiet, that the rhythm is very smooth, and that they are both wearing mutes as well, so the sound is slightly held back too.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I think it's really interesting that you've got the analogy with gemstones, because a lot of what people with synesthesia say is that the colours aren't like pigments on a painting. They're more like stained glass or more like light sources. Is this something that resonates with you?
Yes, very much so. The colour of light compared to the colour of pigment is so different. And then it's the colour of the mind's eye as well. And I think it's definitely the case that you can't polarize it. It's not one thing or the other. It's very much alive, and it's a process that's inside your mind, but also outside. And yes, I think the idea of the gemstones is lovely because it then builds in reflecting light,
Yes.
texture, how solid is it? And that for me was something that I really engaged with.
Yes, exactly. Whereas paintings are 2D and they reflect light in an entirely different way from a gem. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Good question. The next short extract is based on the sapphire stone, so a blue colour. And with this one, a very deep kind of royal blue, so not ethereal like a cerulean blue. And this has actually more power and solidity, and the way the musicians play it is with a real depth of sound. And the final extract is amethyst, so the idea of a purple colour. And you might have noticed by now that I have ordered these in the order of the spectrum, which is not necessarily the way it appears in Revelation, but that made sense to me in the creative process. But purple for me, it feels like it's both warm and cold, which it actually is, literally, with the pigment of paint. So in this, I wanted to show the shimmering sensation with a technique on the violin that they call bariolage. And that's an Italian term. But what it literally means is Greta's bow is crossing the strings, and by doing so, she creates a very resonant shimmering effect. So the piece features that, but then it also features a very expressive melody played on the cello by Richard. So looking at this piece, I thought it was interesting to mention that the celestial feel of these miniatures could also be linked to the sacred nature of some of the Renaissance art of the gallery. And I was thinking in particular of the development of paint pigments, particularly lapis lazuli being also a gemstone and that celestial quality. And I think that it's true to say that as paint pigment developed in art, so too did the wide variety of colours and timbres in musical instruments. And hopefully I've shown a few of those in the extracts you've just heard.
That's lovely to make that link. Yeah, with our collection, perhaps one that listeners could go and have a look at on our website or in the gallery is Sasso Ferrato's The Virgin in Prayer, painted in 1640 to 50 roughly. And yes, it has that beautiful example of the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli used as ultramarine in the Virgin's robe covering over her shoulders there. Really very, very beautiful. And it's really interesting, Deborah, that you talk about, and thank you, Jamie, for your question, that difference in how colour plays in light and how colour plays as a pigment in paint. And it's, something that we have looked at before in the past in terms of, scientifically colour being found in different ways. And so there being, strong differences between what's in a rainbow, what's in the visible spectrum of light, and what are the colours that we might find on an artist's palette. But you've not just been inspired by other musicians, Deborah, or other composers, but you have been inspired by paintings and made with pigments, of course. So could you tell us a bit about your music that you worked on for one of our paintings, which is Monet's Water Lilies, painted after 1916?
Yes, I found this painting so inspiring because it's one of the later ones where you lose all sense of frame or orientation, so the bank of the side or the foliage. And it feels like perspective isn't there anymore, and you're lost in this dreamlike water where you almost come face to face with the colours of his work. And I found that so inspiring in how could I, as a composer, lose myself not only in the colours of Monet, but perhaps then the colours of my mind's eye and my whole imagination and creative process. And so I created a piece, The Spirit of Colour, Esprit de Colour, for cello and violin. And we have an extract of that here to play again. And in this, you will hear a shimmering note, which starts in the violin, where Greta plays 2 strings together. Again, they're open strings on the violin, and which gives a feeling of resonance and shimmering. And against that, Richard's cello line emerges as if from nothing. And the reason for that is so that he draws you in as if you're really becoming immersed in the water of the painting. And the way that I've done that is to use a particular texture on the cello, which is called flautando, like a whisper.
Oh, beautiful.
To somehow evoke that just mysterious nature of what Monet is doing. Again, linking timbre to the idea of what Monet's trying to do as well. We've got a short extract of that, and the idea that is it brings you in with varying textures and takes you on a journey. As much as if you were viewing the painting, you would also go on a kind of journey within it as well.
And I'll just describe the painting for those of you at home that might not have it in front of you or might not be familiar with this particular one of Monet's Water Lilies series. So this is a very monumental painting. It takes up a huge amount of the wall that it's displayed on. It's around 2 by 4 meters in size and depicts this really beautiful, limitless expanse of water, which occupies our whole field of vision. And actually, quite a lot of visitors' response to this painting is, very emotional. We often find visitors cry in front of this painting. And perhaps you might have that experience too. And the huge pale picture surface is alive and shimmering with trails of green, ochre, violet, yellow, sky blue and pink. And the water lily pads seem to kind of play a more secondary role in the painting. They're floating outwards towards the edges and leaving a space in the centre. And it's sort of not clear from the painting whether this shows the reflections of willows, sky or clouds. So we will hear the music now, and perhaps you can imagine Monet's Water Lilies as you hear it. Deborah, you composed this music around this painting in the National Gallery's collection. And it was performed for an event here at the gallery for a Friday late in November 2024. And you collaborated with a poet as well for that event. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it was wonderful to collaborate with the poet Seben Okri. And he had a number of poems which are actually bespoke for the National Gallery. I know he spent a lot of time here. One of them was called On Art and another The House of Enigma. So we were able to create soundscapes to those poems. And what was really exciting was also that he wrote a new poem in response to a piece of mine called Light. And a few lines from it are, "We are the centre of the earth's song. The sun is that music out of which our vision grows. We are in the path, we are the grass of singing," which felt so beautiful. And obviously it's a much longer poem, but he performed that against the violin. And somehow this juxtaposition of words and music then illuminated and elevated the art that was in the room, all the Impressionist paintings, Degas, Monet around us. And I think it added a further dimension to the experience the audience felt, and actually to the way that we played it as well. And so this coming together of words, of music, of colour, all of that, I think, felt very, very powerful and very meaningful.
And you mentioned House of Enigmas by Sven Cree, and that poem he wrote has been adapted also into a digital experience that we have here at the gallery. So you listeners might want to go and explore that. It's a whole new way to experience our paintings. You can find it on our website, we'll put it in the show notes below. But yes, this poem I'll quote from a little because it's almost a kind of soundtrack or introduction to this digital experience that you can do at home. Every Sunday, as far as I can remember, I used to go to the House of Enigmas. I went for delight, for education, for visual psychology, for wonder, for history, form, for colour, prophecy, contemplation, dream, logic, rigour, for the ongoing study in the strange art of being human. And yeah, we would love you to explore the National Gallery Imaginarium at home. So now feels like a good point for us to take our next break, and after the break, we will dive in more to some of the aspects that Jamie can help us define about synesthetes. Welcome back from the break. So Jamie, we wanted to ask you whether there might be biases in synesthetes towards some areas of the colour wheel and why that might be, if so.
That's a very good question. It's something we've only started to discover in the last few years. And we found it in a couple of kinds of synesthesia, those who have colours for letters and numbers, but also in sound colour synesthesia, particularly those who have colours maybe for single notes. And literally all we do is that we present people with letters, numbers, sounds, and they're free to choose the colours. And we find people with synesthesia are more likely to choose colours that are reds, browns, yellows, and so on. And people who don't have synesthesia don't gravitate to those colours in the same way. We don't know exactly why this is, but there's a couple of possibilities. One is around the warmth of the colours, so traditional kind of warm colours feature more heavily.
So that would be reds and browns and oranges.
Yes, exactly, yeah, in contrast with green. So you can get green synesthetic sounds, but people with synesthesia don't produce them in the same way as somebody without synesthesia, where you play a sound and you ask them to choose a colour. Green is a lot more common in people without synesthesia, but of course they're probably using some other mechanism. One of the other things that we kind of know about in what we call natural scene statistics is that if you just walk around with a camera on your head and look at the colours in the world, you find that objects tend to be warmer colours and the backgrounds are blues and greens. So actually colour is a way of segmenting the world into foreground and background. It's obviously not a perfect way of doing it, but on average, this is how it is. So you could think of synesthetic experiences more object-like and less background-like would be another way of kind of framing this bias. But again, we're speculating as to why this might be.
I can imagine that because obviously the cool of like the blue in the sky, the blues of the sea, those tend to be background vistas, don't they? And whilst if we're thinking even actually of pigments, blue, very hard to come by in terms of pigments because it is much more background. It's less... blues are less rooted in real things in the world, real objects.
In art, to get a sense of perspective, you would add more and more blue to kind of convey that, even if it's on a 2D image.
Yeah, so mountains might get bluer into the background.
Exactly, that's
as
right.
They fade away.
The colours will become cooler as they kind of recede. Yeah.
Whilst sort of I think of red earth pigments, and those are very warm colours, and those were, the first and most common pigments apart from charcoal ones. But that makes a lot of sense to me. That the cool is in the background and the warm is in the foreground.
And Deborah, do you feel that you've got a full spectrum of colours, or do you think that some are missing or some are overrepresented?
I think because my synesthesia mostly happens looking at colour in artworks and then translating to music, I tend to have a fairly equal balance of that, actually. If it came about in a different way, I might possibly have that tendency, but because it's quite unusual for me, I love responding to blue and green as much as I do to red and yellow.
Okay.
Interesting. So we've talked about Deborah's own experience of synesthesia, and we've mentioned Kandinsky, but there are probably other famous artists and composers with synesthesia throughout history. Of course, it's difficult to say for sure, but we think the artist Edvard Munch experienced emotions as colours. So you might know his sort of most legendary work, The Scream. David Hockney, I believe, reports sounds as colours, the contemporary artist. And people also say that Vincent van Gogh experienced sounds as colours. And Deborah, were there a few composers as well, sort of famous for being synesthetes in history?
Yes, very much so. In addition to Olivier Messiaen that we've already talked about, you have Alexander Scriabin, 1872 to 1915, who invented a new musical instrument called the clavier à lumière, which was a keyboard with lights that he wanted projected as his orchestral work was performed. And then also Arnold Schoenberg, who, of course, changed everything with the emancipation of dissonance and his creation of serial technique. But also he was actually a painter as well. Okay. And colour was very important to him. And there's one stage work of his called Die glückliche Hand, the Hand of Fate, where he actually has a series of abstract signs in the score which denote colour. So very similar to what Messiaen did. So he's come up
with a kind of musical notation for colour in how he's written the music.
Yeah, very much so. So there's a link there, I think, with the way that Messiaen approached things. And also, just to touch on Kandinsky just one last time, I find it so extraordinary how in his book concerning the spiritual art, he talks about the personalities of colour. And he says things like yellow assails every obstacle and bursts forth aimlessly in every direction, and that red rings inwardly with a determined and powerful intensity. And actually, in a piece of mine in 2024, I set those words for choir and symphony orchestra, and it was actually premiered at the Forbidden City Concert Hall in Beijing in China. And it was very, very interesting because culturally, of course, our understanding of colour can be very different. In China, white is the colour of mourning, whereas here we probably get married in white. But actually, there's also some similarities, and I think this holding red as this vibrant, life-enhancing colour is shared. It represents joy. So that was a very interesting experience, actually, in bringing a colour-based piece to a very different culture from European culture.
Amazing. Yeah, we've talked a little bit on the podcast about emotion and colour before, so you can go back and listen to that episode if you would like, listeners at home, and talked a little bit about the cultural relativity as well. That is a really fascinating subject. And in terms of other artists that you have worked with or been inspired by, Deborah, we would love to talk about Maggie Hamling, who was born in 1945 and was the National Gallery's first artist in residence in 1980. So yes, we therefore have a particular fondness for Maggie with that moment in our history. But you have been particularly inspired by her paintings.
Yes, that's right. I first met Maggie back in 2014, and myself and the violin soloist Harriet Mackenzie went to visit her in her studio in Suffolk, and she showed us the Wall of Water series, which was still in progress, and that, of course, was then on exhibition at the National Gallery in 2015. And I wrote a violin concerto, Wall of Water, in response to this series of seascapes. And when I first saw them, I didn't know what to expect, and it was obviously such a privilege to be there. But I was so moved by the colours that she used, because she painted the North Sea over the course of the year. So all the colours change from very cold colours in the winter to this blazing, huge spectrum of colours in the summer. So for me, that straight away gave me the starting point for this new violin concerto that I was going to write in response to that, because I had the colours there. And rather than depicting every single painting individually, I decided to create my own wave of sound, if you like, my own large architecture that moved from cold to warm colours. And that work was performed at the National Gallery in the Sainsbury Ring Theatre in 2015, as she exhibited by Harriet Mackenzie and the English String Orchestra, conducted by Kenneth Woods.
Beautiful. And I think we can hear a little bit of Wall of Water now.
Yes, we can.
So we will bring in Greta to perform an extract, I believe.
So the opening of Wall of Water begins as if we're coming from darkness, and somehow picks up on the very deep feeling that Maggie has about humanity as well. She says that when she was younger, she used to go and talk to the sea. But as she's got older, she goes and asks to hear what the sea is saying to her. And I know that the North Sea is so important to her in her own creative trajectory. So the opening of this work is very held back. It's very quiet, but it has this sort of pent-up emotion that's going to be unleashed later. So the intervals I'm using are very small. I think the colours are darker. So Greta's just going to demonstrate the just very opening bar that the violin plays. And under it, which we don't have here, there would be held double basses and cellos with this foreboding pedal of sound. And you might notice that as Greta got to the end of the extract, the sound slightly changed. Greta, I don't suppose you could play again the sound that's near the bridge, just for everyone to hear that. And could you now play a normal note, which is in a normal position? And you can hear how different both of those sounds are.
Yes.
And for me as a composer, there was something about having the resonance close to the bridge that picked up somehow all the different sort of brush strokes that Maggie was using, that sense of light that's still there, even though we're beginning in darkness. And it also, if you like, insinuate what's to come. And I find in the process of composition, I almost like to show a blueprint or a DNA for the entire piece, maybe in the very early stages, so you have an idea where you're going to go in terms of the architecture.
To me, the first note felt more transparent and the second one more opaque. That's how I describe it. Obviously, due to the density of the sound. But that's how I would kind of imagine it visually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that would be my intention.
Yeah.
And is to sort of play around with those ideas of density. Yeah. As the music progresses, it becomes warmer in colour. I use the orchestra slightly differently. The solo violinist becomes in more communication with the other instruments. So you have a feeling of unity and hope as the piece progresses. So the next extract will be very similar in the structure of that opening phrase, but it somehow has opened up. And what you can't hear now is the rest of the orchestra that is much more modal and light-filled. And Greta will now play that second extract to show the difference. And Jamie, how did that feel to you compared to the first one?
But yes, it feels kind of quite penetrating and kind of more all-encompassing. Although it's penetrating, I don't have it feels kind of quite close rather than, big. That's very naive words. That's how
and you're absolutely right, because the intervals are still close. And actually, in between that happening and the opening gesture, what happens is the work does open up and we have the the string crossing technique I talked about earlier, where we do then have much wider intervals. So you're absolutely right. The work is a palindrome. So we start from close intervals and then we end with them, but they're just slightly transformed. So it has that sense of symmetry to it.
Thank you so much, Greta. I think that's all we have time for from Greta today. So it's been fantastic to hear some of your experience of the world, Deborah, illustrated in sound. Jamie, I thought we might just end the episode with a question for you, which is, are there areas of synesthesia that you still have lots of questions about, that you're exploring, that you're researching now? What might some of those be, if so?
I think for me, one of the things that we don't have a full answer to is how synesthesia develops. So synesthetes themselves can't remember a time in which they haven't had it, but I'm sure there are roles for culture and experience that shape the synesthesia. And why is one synesthete different from another? There probably aren't different sets of genes for very different ways of experiencing it. So why is it that one brain has, say, intervals, another has taste from words or something like this? So I think that developmental trajectory, I think, is really important and interesting to understand. And for me, I see synesthesia as a kind of a model way of thinking about how we're all different, how all of our brains are different, what is it that creates these differences, how we capture them, and what they actually mean for us in terms of the different niches we employ in life, whether in the creative industries or other occupations that we choose.
Hopefully we might know sometime soon with research to come. So that brings us today to the end of our episode on synesthesia. If you want to explore the National Gallery Imaginarium that I mentioned earlier, you can search for just that, National Gallery Imaginarium, in your browser, in your web browser. But we'll also put a link below in the show notes so you can find it there. And if you've got more questions about the story of colour in art and culture and how colours interacted with human history, you can email us. We're on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk, or you can send us in questions via social media and we'll try and answer some of those for you. So thank you so much for joining us for today's episode, with huge thanks to our guests, Professor Jamie Ward, Dr Deborah Pritchard, violinist Greta Mutlu, and cellist Richard Harwood. I have been your host, Beks. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our technicians were Ian Warren and Tom Gulliver. Our video producers were Alessandro Sorrenti and Amber Akanu, with thanks to the scientific team here at the National Gallery. And thank you very much for listening.